Hey,
Hi.
so good morning. We're here in beautiful Mendocino County to talk about Terragina wine. Chris Buchanan, winemaker, proprietor. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I started making wine. The first vintage I made was at home. It was a small baby barrel in 2011, which was actually a really challenging year for winemaking. I had to hand pick each grape cluster because it was a red wine and there was pretty bad botrytis. I was really diligent in sorting the clusters for the wine. And because I was making such a small amount, that was possible. But I made a really great wine that I still occasionally can drink, very limited
Darius,
quantity.
I try to say, what is botrytis?
Yeah. Botrytis is an infection that happens in grapes. It's usually undesirable. We're going to actually taste in a little bit these two Rieslings where one of them, it is a little bit desirable. And I always make the joke about Riesling is Germany is a pretty wet place. And so they picked the noble grape that grew well with a little bit of rot, which is kind of fascinating.
So there's definitely a lot of connection to the wines that you make and the land that it comes from. So can you tell a little bit about Terragina as a name and what that sort of represents as far as your winemaking and your artistic point of view?
Sure, absolutely. I think that's a great question. Terragina is a Latin word. It means born of the earth. Terra meaning earth, and gina is the root word for generate and Genesis. So that was sort of the foundation, right? That's where art starts. Is you're born, right? And I think that with something like an agricultural product, the earth part is important because it's where it comes from, and that without a respect and an understanding of where you start, it's pretty hubristic, pretty arrogant to think that you could have any idea where you ought to go. And I say ought sort of loosely because I think wines make themselves as much as we make them, and that it's that's what the blend of art and science that we talk about is that dance between the analytical considerations and all of the myriad of detail factors and the art of life, of reality, of the consequences of, existence. And so when those things come together, I think wine is sort of the pinnacle of that blend. And that's what Terragina, tries to encapsulate.
So it seems like, when you started on this project, there was grapes that you had the opportunity to use. When you said you made it in your
So
production.
I found an ad on Craigslist. So I was studying winemaking, and I was thinking, man, if I don't do this, it's going to be hard to remember all of these details because it was a very complex topic, and winemaking lends itself to experience, very, very much so. So much so that I would argue that experience with a good cellar or a good winemaker is in some ways as valuable as an education in winemaking.
And so with the wines that we have here today, we have the Rieslings, but Terragina does a lot of work with Pinot Noir. So can you talk about Pinot Noir and Mendocino County a little bit?
Yeah, so coastal Mendocino County has an incredible terroir for Pinot Noir. Specifically, Anderson Valley really stands up. It has the nice, cool climate with just enough heat to ripen, which also happens to be really great for Riesling. This Wiley Vineyard, we also make a Pinot Noir from, and it's quite nice. But the Riesling it's a unique wine. It's one of the only original plantings in the vineyard. It was planted in the 70s. It's also very notable because it was on its own roots. So most vines in this country are grafted due to phylloxera, which is a disease that grapevines can get on their roots. And so American rootstocks are resistant to that, and we graft most of the vines. These vines were planted sort of early on, before phylloxera was a major concern in that area. And really, it hasn't been a serious concern because it's a very isolated region. But the fact that these vines are still producing is amazing because they do create, as vines age like that, from the 70s, these are now 50 years old. They really do produce more complexity in the wines. And you get unique phenolics and unique characteristics that come from the grapes.
So when we've talked in the past, you've talked about the difference between the grape crop and the other domestic crops like tomatoes, talking about how the Pinot Noir is fundamentally like the same vine today. Can you talk a little bit about that history and what excites you about that sort of tradition in wine?
Yeah, so I always like to think that the history of Pinot Noir or of winemaking is older than the written word. And I think that that's something really cool because other than things like the wheel, there's not a lot of things you interact with every day that are just fundamentally, like a generational memory or a generational creation. Right? Wine is clearly a combination, a blend of art and science, of humans and nature, right? It's born of the earth and then we make it, we create it, it doesn't just happen. And so the fact that over 6,000 years ago, people were doing this, they found this vine and they said, this makes better wine. And then not only did they find it 6,000 years ago, but for the last 6,000 years, they kept it around, they preserved it, they propagated it because vineyards are made from cuttings. Like this Riesling was made from cuttings of Riesling vines that were ultimately from probably Germany because that's where Riesling is sort of originated. And so that's really cool that I get to be part of that chain, and if anybody had sort of faltered or enough people had faltered in that process, we wouldn't have Pinot Noir, but we do. And that's pretty neat.
So that collective wisdom of the past with the present is something that you think speaks to what you bring to your craft today?
I think that it's a really high bar that it sets because it's all been done before, like a lot of times. There's like 6,000 years, right? So it definitely gives some gravitas or some, I guess, responsibility to what I do to do the best because it's been done before, I guess.
Yeah. So on that note, I want to segue because we have 2018 here for these Rieslings. I want to talk about tasting wine in general, and then a little bit about, what we have here and some of the things of note about maybe aging a white wine and why these wines are special. So let's just kind of start with wine tasting, right?
Yeah. So generally speaking, you want to go from a dry wine to a sweet wine. So in this case, we have a dry Riesling and then a late harvest Riesling, which is actually quite sweet. They were actually made from the same vineyard, from the same year, and we picked the same block twice. So we picked the first time for the clean fruit that didn't have any botrytis infection. And then the second time, about 2 weeks later, we picked the second harvest. And that was very light. I mean, we only made like 16 cases of the late harvest, super small production. The fresh one, the earlier harvest, we submitted for some ratings with judges. We got a 90 points from Wine Enthusiasts. We also received Wine of the Year by Varietal and by Country at Sommelier's Choice Award, and a 92 point score there. So that was a really nice honor to have with that wine. But I think it's really cool. I made these. Sometimes a lot of these wines that we do for our club or for limited release they're experimental wines, and they're a little bit of an opportunity to see like what it's like to be a winemaker. So this late harvest wine is very much let's see if we can do it. I was very fortunate that the vineyard owner was patient and supportive of this endeavor. So love is like what makes this all possible, because this is not like a profitable enterprise as a standalone product, but it's a really cool product, and that's why I made it.
Well, I think that there's a lot of different things at Terragina, right? There's the everyday drinking stuff, and then there's the stuff that is really for, sharing an opportunity like this for us to sit down and talk about it.
Absolutely.
And then, just with your meals, with your outside, with your beautiful view. Yeah. So take me through this.
Okay, so
Do I swirl it?
You can. So what swirling does is it sort of elevates the aromatics. It increases the surface area and agitates it. So it's like when you swirl, you can see there's sort of ripples that happen in the surface. Those are sort of a centripetal force, sort of like kind of pushing stuff outward, right? Like aromatics, the molecules that you can smell. So when you do that, and with the taper of the glass, that'll tend to give you more intensity for the aromatic. So it's sort of like a good wine glass has this taper, so it sort of focuses those. It has a wider base, and then swirling does give you a little bit of lift to that and agitation of the air, because if it's just sitting still, it never, kind of lifts up.
I think this table lends well to that.
It does. It's a great table for swirling.
Great table for swirling.
And also, that's a good newbie trick. Swirl on a table, because it's like way harder not to swirl. This is a tricky move, right? So,
I have fearfully tried to not spill on myself. So what do you get here? Tell me about your...
Yeah, so it's very Riesling, and Riesling has a very, some people call it fuel, or I always think of it as a pool toy, like when you open a beach ball for the first time at the beginning of summer, has that smell to it. And I know it's kind of a weird smell, but it's also kind of reminds me of fun days at the beach, and getting a new toy to play with at the swimming pool when I was a kid. So I like it for that. Riesling reminds me of my childhood.
You have a pretty developed palate, though, and you've established some good language around talking to about wine. Can you sort of discuss how that journey?
Yeah. So I mean, taking wine tasting courses, practice. It's like any skill. If you think about it and you focus at it, you tend to improve. And since it's a sensory skill, it's just like a passion, right? It's something that you practice. There's classes, they're great to do. This exercises like this are really a great way to sort of explore, what I've found to be the most useful is it's like this, but not like that. And sort of comparing and contrasting different wines, either similar wines or different wines, because similar wines you can sort of see within a theme, but different wines, it's kind of cool to calibrate between these sort of extremes. But the joke, one of my earliest wine tasting classes was, some days you just are off and here's this page and it has a bunch of wine descriptors, throw darts at it, and then that's your description for the meal. Because a lot of wine tasters or a lot of people writing tasting notes are sommeliers at a restaurant, and they have to produce a note for the day a lot of the time.
Okay, so we're not going to blow out our palates today because we're going to start light here.
Yeah.
I love these wines. I love these wines. This is not the first year you've made this Riesling.
No.
What else do you get from this? Anything else of note about this single vineyard?
Yeah. So, one thing about the single vineyard wines that's really cool is we make them by hand, and both of these were hand pressed. This one was a lot of work because it was a pretty large lot, but I think that the hand pressing, especially in Pinot Noir, but also in Riesling, I found with the basket press, it gives you a more complex or more complete extraction, or maybe just a different extraction than some other forms of presses. So that was something cool. The other thing that happened in 18 that didn't happen in 17, so we're going to compare and contrast, is that 18 was a little bit riper than 17, even though it rained. It's kind of bizarre, but it was more ripe. And so it actually, this is kind of weird because in 17, the acidity in Riesling is really high. So occasionally we do add a very small amount of residual sugar, like 1 gram per liter or 2 grams per liter. And what that can do is balance the really high acidity. Think about like lemonade, right? Like if it's too acidic, it's going to really be unpleasant. That's not sweet. It's still just balanced.
Right.
And so that's what in 17, I used a technique called Süßreserve, which is where you take the juice at harvest and then blend it back in the finished wine to balance that acidity.
Okay.
In 18, it was at a riper level and things were more balanced. So I knew I didn't need to do that. But sort of serendipitously, because of the weather, because of the other factors, the 18 stopped fermentation naturally at the exact, like within 0.01 of what I did with the Süßreserve the prior year. So the sugar levels are sort of are the same, but the makeup of the sugar is different.
Okay.
Because yeast prefer fructose. Yeah, right. So yeast prefer fructose, which actually tastes sweeter to us. So even though this one has it just has different characteristic.
So there's a conversation.
There's a whole
if you want to
conversation
have
to talk
it
about
the grapes. Is it the farmer? Is it the winemaker?
Right.
I hear you being on both sides of this. Do you want to tell me a little bit about what kind of some of the industry?
Yeah. So I would say that in an ideal world, the farmer does the best he can to make the best grapes for wine, and the winemaker takes over and does what they can with it, right?
At some point, the weather is the weather.
Yeah, you can't control when it rains. It's the weather, there's no controlling the weather. So in that regard, it definitely needs to be a collaboration between the grower and the winemaker. It's useful to have the specialization, which is really common in this country, just because there's so many factors involved in both, and managing all of those.
Well, yeah. So, for example, one of the nice things about smaller production wines, right, is this diversity, because there is the larger brands, this expectation, right, that vintage to vintage, there is the same consistent flavor profile because that's what people want. Right. But when everything starts tasting the same, is that
right, where's the art?
Where's the art? So can we talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's fascinating.
Yes. So that's actually a really good point. If you think about a large produced wine or a commercial wine, like a more commercial style, you could think of it like an art print every year, right? It's a reprint of the same.
It's a great print.
It's a great print, but it's a print.
It's a print,
right? When you start doing things like this, you get a new painting every year, and it's going to be a little bit different. So you might prefer one year to another. But what I urge you to do, and what keeps me excited about winemaking, is appreciate each year for what it is, right? Like for all of the elements that went into it. Yes, we did the Seuss Reserve in 17, and we didn't do it in 18. Maybe you like 17, maybe you like 18. The point is, it's cool that that is, those are options, and that we're, in a way that you would argue that's sort of like trying to make a print, because we did set the numbers, although it happened backwards, right? Because I set the numbers the year before, and then they just happened the second year, so that's kind of a curiosity. But yeah, it's different, different year to year, within a theme, right? Because they're single vineyards, so you should have a vineyard character, you should have an appellation character that's pretty consistent.
But there are a couple of wines, these are a great example, that you took two from the same year, from the same vineyard, from the same weather, to look at some other nuanced aspects, right? So should we look at this late harvest? And can you tell me and everybody that's listening what makes the late harvest late harvest?
Yeah, it was later.
In addition to the 2 weeks.
So in addition, the 2 weeks would be the main thing, to be a late harvest. There are some legal definitions, which is as far exceeds, but in terms of sugar levels at harvest and things like that. But the other element of this one is that it was botrytized.
Whoa, look at that color.
Botrytis, right? And then you get a different color. Part of that honey, that browning, that sort of golden color comes from the botrytis reactions.
I thought I could see that in the bottle, but then I wasn't
really
sure.
Can,
but you can definitely see it.
Holy moly.
A lot.
So that's like the botrytis, that's that oxidative character that happens. And then smell the wine. I'm
going to. I'm checking out this cork though. These are really nice. How'd you pick these corks?
So these are individually tested TCA-free corks. In 2018, we transitioned to origine corks, which are agglomerated corks that are guaranteed 100% TCA-free. Cork taint is still an issue even with any natural cork. The agglomerated corks are consistent, so I know every bottle is going to be the same high quality, and they're also guaranteed not to have that cork taint. Cork taint is a real issue. It's probably down to less than 1%, so it's not that big of a deal. But when you're making works of art, you want to keep them in the nicest packaging you can, right? Like, so that's what we do. So you can see, as you can see, the color's totally different. The aromatics, as you can smell, this has much more, almost like a musty, sort of like caramelly, like almost like burnt apple, like a cooked apple, or kind of
This tastes like mead almost, like to me.
honey. Yeah, a really honey flavor, right? And then this is the crisp dry wine. That's the difference a 2 weeks on the vine and a botrytis infection makes. It's pretty substantial, right?
Now, this though, you know, like as an after dinner
Yeah.
or something like that, I think could be really, really nice because it's not so sweet. It has,
acidity, yeah. And that's what Riesling does really well, is holds the acidity.
but the 2018, right? A lot of times when you're shopping in the United States, you see white wines. They're a little bit closer to what the current
year,
year is. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. So, you know, I was talking about old vines.
Yeah.
I'm talking about hand pressing. A lot of those factors come into play with ageability for white wines. One thing that really plays into white wine ageability is phenolics. And as vines mature, they tend to produce more complex fruit. And those factors can also be a preservative or protective factor. And they also, those phenolics, those compounds, and some tannins as well, they mature as the wine ages.
Okay.
If I'm making a wine sort of commercially for churn and burn to be ready next week or next month, I'm going to clarify the juice a lot more. I'm going to clean it up a lot more so that it's just crisp and fruity and fresh and easy to drink right up front. But that wine is going to die within 2 or 3 years because it doesn't have the structure to stand up over the long haul. When I made these Rieslings, I make them in a very traditional way by hand pressing them, by getting that extraction and then balancing that as we age it in barrel with the blending of the wines to create a final product, a work of art that endures. And so I think that while older wines do taste different than younger wines, if made correctly, if made carefully, they are as interesting, if not maybe more interesting in some cases, than the younger version. In part, that's because the brightness and the fruitiness of youth sort of starts to fall back. And then you start to get some of these more sort of what I think of as vineyard and tertiary characteristics that come from the actual sort of, for lack of a better term, decomposition of the grape characteristics into their final resting place. But just like, you know, a short, exciting life can be fun, but also like a long, complex life can be interesting too, right?
Those are... And we actually offer these to be sold as a 2-pack. Can you talk about why someone might want to try them together, or aside from what we're doing right here?
So when I talked about sort of like two extremes, like, right, you can have two extremes within any box, right? So you can change the box, right? You could have like Cabernet and I don't know, Gruner Veltliner. I don't know. They're different grapes, right? So, or within Riesling, these are sort of two extremes of the Riesling. Like you got a dry, crisp Riesling, and I think that Riesling is really cool because, or problematic or cool, whatever you want to call it, because there's so many different ways that it can be produced. You can make a dry Riesling, you can make a sweet Riesling, and they can be very interesting, as you can see between the two. Why you would want to taste both? One, to calibrate your palate, and two, just to kind of get a range of what these two wines can be. So you have an understanding. And then also, if you want to go buy a Riesling at a wine shop, you have more education. Say, you know what, I want a Riesling with a little residual sugar for an after dinner, or I want a dry Riesling. And then you can even expand beyond Riesling, because these are actually sort of similar to Sauvignon Blanc. And you've got late harvest Sauvignon Blancs that are incredible, and you've got dry Sauvignon Blancs that are incredible. So this sort of will give you a sense of what a sweet white and a dry white can be and what that experience is like.
I love that. And I think also, I'm learning some new words to talk about things that I like or that I might want to find if I'm trying to shop out. Is there anything else about the Wiley Vineyard or about the late harvest or the dry Riesling that we didn't touch upon?
I think I would reemphasize the own-rooted older vines. I think that really is why these wines have character and ageability. Yeah. And I would say that I think they're both interesting for different reasons. And but it's really neat to do the side by side. I don't actually do that this often, so I'm quite enjoying trying through both of these and sort of seeing, you know, there's what they were like when we bottled them, what they were like a year after, and then there's what they're like right now. And that is always an ever changing situation. And so it's always neat to kind of check in.
To revisit, right? Because you make a lot of wines.
I make a
lot of wines, right?
Yeah.
And is there anything about the way that this hangs on the glass at all that is notable? Is there anything else wine speak that could be
So what you'll notice with the late harvest is it's got like a much richer mouthfeel.
I feel like it's getting on the glass
sugar.
and like hanging
Oh yeah,
out,
it's because
like,
it's thicker. It's got,
like
it's syrup, it's sugar. When we pressed this wine, it was like sugar and almost looked like grape concentrate because it was so thick from, I mean, it was like, you know, after fermentation, this had 145 grams per liter of sugar. So to put that into perspective, a normal like ready, like wine, like a red wine, just a Pinot Noir that I would make would have about 210 to 250 grams per liter. Okay. So this has almost as, you know, like it's pushing the level where it would be, if it didn't already have alcohol, it could go a whole nother wine, right? Yeah, so it's pretty fascinating how that balances. And the alcohol is actually, even though it's a late harvest, had a lot longer fermentation, started with a lot more sugar. This one ended at 13.1%, and the late harvest was 13.8. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of the factors is botrytis is inhibitory to fermentation, so it makes it a more challenging environment for the yeast. And I think that's kind of one of the beauties is that like push-pull dance that creates the beauty of late harvest wines in general, or it can create disaster, but you know, we try to avoid the disasters. But this was very arguably not a disaster.
So if someone wanted to do this at home, would they need to invest in a Coravin if they had just two people, or how long can these wines stay in your refrigerator?
Right.
Or how?
I mean, a Coravin's always a great option, but you could absolutely do these overnight, and it might even provide some interesting information on how they mature over a couple days, you know. 2 or 3 days. If you cork them, if you have any kind of inert gas, they sell little gas
take the things out
canisters. Well, yeah, you can even just use the regular cork, but it has a little spray and you spray the gas in there and then cork it right away. It really minimizes the oxygen impact on the wine. It's still going to pick up some. And like I said, that kind of gives you a little bit of a aging sort of, I don't want to say a preview, but it's sort of with enough experience, it'll give you an idea of what it's going to become.
All right, so I think maybe we'll take a pause here and move on to our next set of wines.
Sounds awesome. No, this is
cool.